Today, we're going to dive into something that might just flip what you think you know about extreme poverty. We're looking at an incredible landmark study that explored the economic lives of the world's poorest people across 13 countries, and it changes everything.
So the whole thing really kicks off with this simple, but honestly incredibly profound question from the researchers, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. They ask this, and it's such a great question, isn't it? It just cuts through all the statistics and forces you to think about the real, human, day-to-day reality.
Okay, so when I say living on $1 a day, what's the first image that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably a constant, desperate search for the next meal, right? The idea that every single penny must go toward just getting enough calories to survive. But is that what's really going on?
Well, it turns out the reality is so much more complex, and frankly, way more fascinating. The data shows it's not just a simple story of survival. It's a story of really smart, complex economic choices being made under the toughest constraints you can possibly imagine. It's a story of remarkable entrepreneurship. And that leads us to our first big puzzle. How do people in extreme poverty actually spend their money? You might think you know the answer, but I promise you, it's probably not what you're expecting.
Okay, take a look at this. This breaks down a typical budget for a poor household in Udaipur, India. And yeah, food is the biggest piece of the pie, no surprise there, it's 56%. But that's where the obvious part ends. Look closer. A massive 14% on festivals, 5% on alcohol and tobacco. These were significant chunks of a tiny budget going to things we might not think of as necessities.
And this right here is the perfect example of where our assumptions just completely fall apart. We think, okay, the goal has to be maximizing calories for the least amount of money. But that's not what people do. They're buying better tasting food, which costs more. They're spending a good chunk on sugar. What this tells us is that social life, culture, and a little bit of joy, these things are being prioritized. In this number, just let this sink in for a second, 10%. In the Udaipur study, that's what the median household spent of its entire annual budget on festivals, things like weddings and religious ceremonies. That is just stunning. It tells us that joy, community, and having the place in your society, they aren't luxuries you get after you have enough money. They're essential parts of life, period.
So if spending habits are a puzzle, wait until you see how people are earning this money in the first place. This is where the picture of this economic life gets even clearer and even more complex.
To really get this, let's stop talking about data for a second and talk about a person. Let me introduce you to a woman the researchers met in Guntur, India. Her daily life is basically a masterclass in what it means to be an entrepreneur on the edge. So every morning, she's out on the street with a small stove selling dosas, a type of pancake, for breakfast. It's a classic street food business. Simple enough. But that's just job number one for the day. Yeah, once that morning breakfast rush is over, her day is far from done. She completely pivots. She might sell some decorated saris that she's worked on. Or maybe she'll go out and collect trash to sell for recycling. Or she'll make pickles to sell. It's not one job, it's a whole portfolio of them. And here's the kicker. She's not some unique outlier. She's the norm. In rural Udaipur, a mind-boggling 94% of poor households have more than one source of income. And this isn't just chaos. It's a deliberate strategy. It's about managing risk. Think about it. If your crops fail or one small business dries up, you're not totally wiped out. But there's a huge trade-off, right? It's almost impossible to get great at any one thing, to specialize and develop a really high-value skill because you're always juggling. So this begs the question, why live like this? Why all these tiny businesses instead of one stable job? Well, to get why these choices actually make perfect sense, you have to understand the world they're operating in. And it is a world filled with constant risk. And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, I get it, but why not just get a loan? A little bit of capital to grow that one best business and really focus on it. It seems so obvious, doesn't it? But this is exactly where the system breaks down for them. This table pretty much says it all. You've got formal banks on one side, with those reasonable interest rates. But for the poor, they might as well be on another planet. The banks want collateral, which is the one thing they don't have. So what's the alternative? They have to go to informal lenders, local money lenders, the shopkeeper down the street. And just look at the numbers from Udaipur. Barely 6% get a loan from a bank. Meanwhile, more than half are relying on these informal and way more expensive sources.
And when I say expensive, I mean really expensive. Check this out. 3.84%. That's the average interest rate they're paying
per month. Annually, that's over 46%. Can you even imagine trying to get ahead with a loan like that? At that rate, you're not borrowing to invest, you're just borrowing to survive until next week.
And this problem isn't just about loans. It's the whole financial system. Trying to find a safe place to save your money? Good luck. Formal health insurance? Pretty much non-existent. So people have to rely on each other, friends, family. And that's great, until a disaster like a flood or a drought hits the entire community at once. Then that informal network just collapses. And what happens then? What's your fallback? Well, your only options are things like eating less food or pulling your children out of school. Those are the insurance policies.
Okay, so the private markets, for credit, savings, insurance, they're just not working for the poor. But, hold on, isn't that what government services are for? The public safety nets? Well, let's take a look at that. The data here is, honestly, it's pretty damning. This multi-country survey found that on any given day, almost 20% of public school teachers just don't show up for work. And it gets even worse. For public health workers, it's over a third. Think about that. These are supposed to be the front lines of the safety net, and a huge chunk of the time, there's nobody there. And the knock-on effects of this are just devastating. You have schools where nobody's teaching, so of course kids aren't learning. In India, over a third of kids can't even read a simple second-grade text. You have public health clinics that are empty, so where do people go when they're sick? They're forced to spend what little money they have on private providers, who are often completely unqualified because it's literally their only choice. So, let's put all these pieces of the puzzle together. You've got these surprising spending choices, these complex earning strategies, and a world where markets and public services are basically broken for you. When you see it all laid out, a totally different and much richer picture of poverty starts to form.
And here's the big takeaway. The economic life of the poor is not one of passive suffering or helplessness. Not at all. It is a life of constant, active, and frankly, brilliant management. They are essentially portfolio managers, but their portfolio isn't stocks and bonds, it's an incredible collection of risks, and they have to manage it all with zero safety nets inside a system that just wasn't built for them.
But all of this juggling, this constant management, it comes at a huge price, a human cost. The researchers found that while people didn't always report being unhappy, their stress levels, the amount of worry and tension and anxiety they felt, were through the roof. The sheer mental load of living this way is just enormous.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. What if the heaviest burden of poverty isn't the lack of money itself? What if the real weight, the thing that is so exhausting, is the relentless, crushing stress of having to make one impossible choice after another, day in and day out, knowing that you have absolutely no margin for error?